The wind howled like a wild animal as Jake's old pickup truck coughed and wheezed down the mountain road. Snow was coming down so thick he could barely see 10 feet ahead. His truck's heater had given up the ghost about 50 miles back, and now ice was forming on the inside of his windshield. Jake pulled his worn cowboy hat down tighter and squinted through the storm. He'd been driving for hours, trying to make it to the next town before this blizzard really hit. But Mother Nature had other plans. His truck started making that grinding sound again, the one that meant big trouble and even bigger repair bills. "Come on, old girl," he muttered, patting the dashboard like it was a faithful horse. "Just a few more miles." But the truck had other ideas. With a final shudder and a cloud of steam from under the hood, it rolled to a stop on the side of the road. Jake sat there for a moment, listening to the wind shake the cab. He was in the middle of nowhere, with the storm getting worse by the minute. He grabbed his jacket from the passenger seat and stepped out into the cold. The wind hit him like a slap in the face. Snow stung his eyes as he popped the hood. Steam billowed out, and he could see the problem right away: a busted radiator hose. In this weather, with no tools and no spare parts, he might as well try to lasso the moon. Jake looked around, trying to get his bearings. Through the swirling snow, he could make out lights in the distance. Big, fancy lights that suggested a house, maybe even a rich person's place. He'd rather sleep in his truck than beg for help, but the temperature was dropping fast. Pride wouldn't keep him warm if he froze to death. He grabbed his duffel bag and started walking toward the lights. The snow was already ankle-deep and getting deeper. Each step was a struggle, and the wind tried to push him back where he came from. But Jake had been through worse. Growing up on a ranch teaches you to be tough. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, he reached a set of massive iron gates. Beyond them, a long driveway led to what looked like a mansion. Warm yellow light spilled from dozens of windows, and Jake could see expensive cars parked under a covered area. This wasn't just rich people's house. This was seriously wealthy territory. A small security booth sat next to the gates, and Jake could see someone inside. He walked up and knocked on the window. His knuckles already numb from the cold. A security guard slid the window open, looking annoyed. He was a big guy, in his 50s, with the kind of face that said he'd heard every sob story in the book. "What do you want?" the guard asked, not bothering to hide his irritation. "My truck broke down about a mile back," Jake said, trying to keep his teeth from chattering. "I'm not asking for money or nothing. Just wondering if I could use a phone to call for help." The guard looked Jake up and down, taking in his worn jeans, scuffed boots, and old jacket. "Sorry, pal, this is private property. There's a gas station about 15 miles down the road." 15 miles? Jake couldn't believe it. In this storm? "Not my problem," the guard said, starting to close the window. "Wait," a new voice came from behind the guard. Jake could see another man approaching the booth, tall, maybe in his 40s, wearing an expensive-looking coat. Even in the dim light, Jake could tell this guy had money written all over him. "What's going on, Tom?" the man asked the guard. "Just some drifter, Mr. Blackwood. His truck broke down. I was telling him about the gas station down the road." "Mr." Blackwood stepped outside the booth, not seeming to mind the snow. He looked at Jake with curious eyes, not the suspicious look Jake was used to getting from rich folks. 15 miles in this weather?" Blackwood said. "That's not happening. Tonight," he turned to Jake. "You look like you know your way around horses." Jake wasn't sure where this was going, but he nodded. "Been working with them my whole life. I thought so." There's something about the way a man carries himself when he's spent time in the saddle. Blackwood made a decision. "Tom, open the gates. We'll put him up in the guest house tonight." The guard looked shocked. "Sir, are you sure?" "We don't know anything about this guy. I know he's cold, his truck's broken, and there's a blizzard coming." Blackwood turned back to Jake. "I'm Robert Blackwood. You can stay the night, get warm, use the phone in the morning when this storm passes?" Jake hesitated. He wasn't used to charity, especially from people who lived in places like this. But the wind chose that moment to gust even harder, and he could feel the cold seeping into his bones. "I appreciate that, sir." "Name's Jake Martinez. I can work for my keep. I'm good with animals, fixing things, whatever you need. Robert smiled. The first real smile Jake had seen in weeks. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Right now, let's get you out of this cold. The gates swung open, and Robert gestured for Jake to follow him up the driveway. As they walked, Jake tried not to gawk at the mansion. It was the kind of place he'd only seen in movies, 3 stories tall, with columns and balconies and enough windows to light up a small town. Beautiful place, Jake said, because it seemed like he should say something. Thanks, my wife picked out most of the details. There was something sad in Robert's voice when he mentioned his wife. They walked around to a smaller building behind the main house. It looked like it had been a carriage house once upon a time, but now it was fixed up as a guest cottage. Robert opened the door and flicked on the lights. The inside was nicer than most hotel rooms Jake had stayed in. There was a kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, and through an open door he could see a bedroom with a big, comfortable-looking bed. There's food in the fridge, firewood by the hearth, Robert said. Bathrooms through there, and there are clean towels in the closet. Jake set down his duffel bag, still not quite believing this was happening. I can't thank you enough, Mr. Blackwood. Soon as the storm passes, I'll be out of your hair. No rush and call me Robert. The man paused at the door. Jake, can I ask you something? What brought you out here in weather like this? Jake thought about how to answer that. The truth was complicated. Lost his ranch, lost his job, been drifting for months trying to figure out what came next. But Robert seemed like the kind of man who'd understand the short version. Sometimes life doesn't go the way you planned, Jake said. Been looking for work, a fresh start somewhere. Robert nodded like he understood exactly what Jake meant. Funny how storms sometimes blow us exactly where we need to be. After Robert left, Jake stood in the warm cottage, listening to the wind outside. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about shelter from a storm. There had been something in Robert's eyes, like he was looking for something he'd lost. Jake started a fire in the fireplace and settled into a chair to warm up. Tomorrow he'd call a tow truck, get his radiator fixed, and be on his way. But tonight, for the first time in months, he felt like maybe his luck was starting to change. Jake woke up to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. Then it all came back, the storm, the broken truck, and the millionaire who'd given him shelter. He sat up in the most comfortable bed he'd slept in for months and looked outside. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world covered in fresh white snow. Everything looked clean and peaceful, like nature had hit the reset button. Jake could see his truck in the distance, buried under a good foot of snow. Getting that thing running again was going to take some doing. He found coffee and eggs in the kitchen and made himself a simple breakfast. As he was washing his plate, there was a knock at the door. Jake opened it to find Robert standing there with a steaming cup in his hands and a thoughtful expression on his face. Morning, Jake. Sleep well? Better than I have in months, thanks. To you, Jake stepped aside to let Robert in. I was just about to come find you, see about calling a tow truck. Robert settled into one of the chairs by the fireplace. I already made some calls. Mickey's Garage will be out this afternoon to take a look at your truck. They're good people, honest prices, quality work. Jake felt a weight lift off his shoulders. Dealing with mechanics in strange towns was always a gamble. I appreciate that. What do I owe you for the trouble? Nothing, but I was hoping we could talk about something else. Robert took a sip of his coffee like he was trying to decide how to start. You mentioned you were looking for work. That's right. I'm good with horses, cattle, ranch work in general. Can fix most things that break, handle heavy machinery. What about kids? The question caught Jake off guard. Kids? I don't know much about kids, to be honest. Never had any of my own? Robert was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee cup. I have a son, Danny. He's 16, and... Robert paused, searching for the right words. Things have been difficult. For him lately? Jake waited. He'd learned that sometimes the best thing to do was let people tell their story in their own time. My wife died 6 months ago, Robert continued. Cancer. It was it was hard on all of us, but Danny took it especially rough. He's angry all the time now. Doesn't talk to me, doesn't listen to his teachers. He's been through 3 different counselors, and I even tried sending him to a boarding school, but that just made things worse. Jake was starting to understand where this conversation was heading, and it made him uncomfortable. I'm sorry for your loss. But if you're thinking I could help with your boy, I'm not sure I'm the right person. Like I said, I don't know much about kids. That might be exactly why you're the right person. Robert leaned forward. Yesterday morning, Danny was out by the stables when I brought you up to the guest house. He saw you walking, the way you carried yourself, and he asked me who you were. That's the first time in months he's shown interest in anything. Jake shook his head. Just because a kid notices someone doesn't mean there's more. Robert interrupted. After I left you last night, I went to check on Danny. He was standing at his window, watching the guest house. When I asked him what he was doing, he said the man in the guest house looked like someone who knew about real things. Real things? His mother used to take him to a small ranch outside town every summer. He loved it there, the horses, the simple life, the way everything had a purpose. Since she died, he's been stuck in this world of private schools and therapy sessions and people who want to fix him with fancy degrees. Robert set down his coffee cup. Maybe what he needs isn't someone with a degree. Maybe he needs someone who understands that sometimes the best healing happens when you're working with your hands. Jake walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered property. In the distance, he could see a big stable and what looked like riding trails. It was the kind of setup most ranch hands could only dream of working on. What exactly are you asking me to do? Jake said finally. Stay on here. Work with the horses, teach Danny to ride properly, show him ranch work. Give him something real to focus on instead of all this grief and anger. And in return, room and board plus a salary. That's probably more than you made at your last ranch job. Your truck gets fixed, you get a chance to save some money, figure out your next move. Jake turned back to face Robert. The offer was generous, too generous. Why, you don't know anything about me? I could be a criminal, a drifter, anything? Robert smiled. You could be. But last night, when you were cold and desperate, you still offered to work for your keep instead of just taking charity. That tells me something about your character. There's got to be more to it than that. Robert was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. My wife used to say I was losing touch with who I really was. All this money, this business success, she worried it was changing me, making me forget where I came from. She was probably right. He stood up and walked to the window. I grew up on a small ranch in Texas. My dad worked cattle, and I spent every summer learning everything he could teach me. Then I got a scholarship to college, started a tech company, made more money than I ever dreamed of. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being the person my wife fell in love with. Jake was starting to understand. And you think having me around will help with that? I think maybe we can help each other. You need a place to land, and Danny needs someone who understands that the best lessons don't come from a classroom. Robert turned back to Jake. What do you say, 1-month trial? If it doesn't work out, you leave with enough money to buy a better truck and start fresh somewhere else. Jake thought about his options. He could get his truck fixed and keep drifting, looking for ranch work that was getting harder to find. Or he could take a chance on this strange opportunity with people who seemed genuine but came from a world he didn't understand. Your son might not like having a stranger around, Jake said. He might not. But right now, he doesn't like much of anything. At least this way, he'd be learning something useful while he figures out how to deal with his grief. There was something in Robert's voice that reminded Jake of his own father. That mix of love and worry that comes when you're trying to do right by your family but don't know how. 1-month trial, Jake said finally. But I do things my way. If I'm going to teach your boy about ranch work, we do it right. No shortcuts, no special treatment because he's rich. Robert's face lit up with the first genuine smile Jake had seen from him. I wouldn't have it any other way. They shook hands, and Jake felt like he was stepping into something bigger than just a job. Maybe Robert was right, maybe Storm's really did blow people exactly where they needed to be. "When do I meet Danny?" Jake asked. "How about right now?" "He's probably down at the stables, avoiding his tutor." Robert headed for the door. "Fair warning, he's not going to make this easy. He's got a lot of anger built up, and he's not used to people who don't give up on him." As they walked toward the main house, Jake wondered what he'd gotten himself into. Teaching a grieving rich kid about ranch life wasn't exactly what he'd planned when he'd headed out into that storm. But then again, nothing in his life had gone according to plan lately. Maybe it was time to try something different. The stable was impressive, bigger than most barns Jake had worked in, with 12 stalls and equipment that looked like it belonged in a magazine. But what caught his attention was the kid sitting on a hay bale in the corner, earbuds in, staring at his phone like it held the secrets of the universe. Danny Blackwood looked exactly like what Jake expected from a rich man's son: expensive clothes, perfect haircut, and an attitude that said the world owed him something. But there was something else there too. The way his shoulders hunched, the dark circles under his eyes, the way he held himself apart from everything around him. Jake recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror plenty of times. "Danny," Robert called out, "I want you to meet someone." The kid looked up with the kind of expression teenagers reserve for parents who are about to ruin their day. When he saw Jake, his eyes flickered with interest for just a second before the wall went back up. "This is Jake Martinez. He's going to be working with the horses, and I thought maybe he could teach you some things about ranch work." Danny pulled out his earbuds and stood up slowly. "Let me guess, another one of your projects to fix me." Robert's jaw tightened, but Jake stepped forward before things could get heated. "Your dad says you know horses, that true?" Danny shrugged. "I can ride. Mom taught me when I was little." "Good, because these horses look like they need exercise, and I need to figure out what I'm working with here." Jake walked over to the nearest stall, where a beautiful chestnut moray stuck her head out to investigate. "What's her name?" "Luna," Danny said, his voice softening just a little. "She was Mom's favorite." Jake let Luna sniff his hand, then gave her neck a gentle pat. The horse leaned into his touch, and Jake could feel some of the tension in the stable ease up. "She's got good eyes," Jake said. "You can tell a lot about a horse from their eyes. This one's smart and gentle, but she's got spirit too." He looked at Danny. "Want to help me get her saddled up? I'd like to see how she moves." For a moment, Jake thought the kid was going to refuse. Then Danny walked over and started pulling out tack from a nearby cabinet. His movements were smooth and practiced. Whoever had taught him knew what they were doing. Robert watched them work for a few minutes, then quietly slipped away. Jake pretended not to notice, but he was grateful. This was going to be hard enough without an audience. They worked in silence, getting Luna ready to ride. Danny knew what he was doing, but Jake could see places where his technique could improve. Instead of pointing them out right away, Jake just watched and made mental notes. "You want to ride her first?" Jake asked when they were done. Danny hesitated. "I haven't ridden much since ... double quotes." He didn't finish the sentence, but Jake understood. That's okay. Sometimes when we lose someone important, the things we used to do with them hurt too much. Jake swung up into the saddle, and Luna responded immediately to his presence. But horses don't understand grief. They just know whether you're present with them or not. Jake rode Luna around the indoor arena, getting a feel for her gait and temperament. She was well trained, but hadn't been worked enough lately. Like her owner, she was dealing with loss in her own way. After a few minutes, Jake dismounted and handed the reins to Danny. "Your turn." Danny took the reins but didn't get on right away. "What if I'm not as good as I used to be?" "Then you practice until you are again. That's how everything worthwhile works." Danny mounted up, and Jake could see immediately that the kid had real talent. His seat was natural, his hands gentle but firm. Luna responded to him like they'd been partners for years. "Good," Jake said as Danny rode past. "But you're holding your left shoulder too high. Relax it." Danny adjusted, and his riding improved instantly. "How'd you know that?" "Because I've been watching horses and riders my whole life." "Your mom taught you well, but she probably didn't get to teach you everything. They spent the next hour working together. Jake showed Danny how to read Luna's body language, how to communicate through subtle shifts in weight and pressure. The kid was a quick learner, and more importantly, he seemed to come alive when he was working with the horse. When they were done, Danny helped Jake brush Luna down and put away the tack. It wasn't until they were finishing up that he finally asked the question Jake had been waiting for. "So what's your deal? Dad pay you extra to be nice to the messed up kid?" Jake considered his answer carefully. "Your dad's paying me to work with the horses and teach you ranch skills if you're interested. That's it. I'm not a counselor or a therapist or whatever else you've been dealing with." "Then why are you really here?" Jake hung up the bridle and turned to face Danny. "Because my truck broke down in a snowstorm and your dad was decent enough to help out a stranger. Now I need work and he needs someone who knows horses. Sometimes life's that simple." Danny studied Jake's face like he was trying to decide whether to believe him. "Most of Dad's employees treat me like I'm made of glass. Like if they say the wrong thing, I'll break. Will you?" The question caught Danny off guard. "What? Will you break if someone says the wrong thing? Because if you will, then maybe I'm not the right person for this job. I tend to say what I think." Danny almost smiled. "Almost. I'm not that fragile." "Good, because working with horses requires honesty. They can sense when you're faking, when you're holding back, when you're pretending to be something you're not." Jake picked up a pitchfork and started mucking out Luna's stall. "If you want to keep learning, you show up tomorrow morning at 7. We'll start with the basics and work our way up." "The basics? But I already know how to ride." "Riding's just one part of ranch work. You want to really understand horses, you need to understand everything: feeding, grooming, medical care, training, equipment maintenance." Jake kept working as he talked. "Most people think ranch work is just riding around looking cool. Real ranch work is 90% maintenance and 10% adventure." Danny picked up another pitchfork and started helping with the stall. "What if I don't want to do this?" "Then don't. But don't waste my time pretending you're interested if you're not." They worked in silence for a while. Jake could feel Danny watching him, trying to figure him out. Finally, the kid spoke up again. "Everyone keeps telling me I need to talk about my feelings, process my grief, work through my issues." Danny's voice was tight with frustration. "But talking doesn't bring her back. It doesn't make anything better." Jake stopped working and leaned on his pitchfork. "You're right, talking doesn't fix everything. Sometimes the best healing happens when your hands are busy and your mind can rest." "Is that what happened to you?" The question was sharp, direct. Jake realized Danny was more observant than he'd given him credit for. "What makes you think something happened to me?" "Because you're here. Really successful people don't usually end up working for my dad unless something went wrong somewhere." Jake had to admit the kid had a point. "I lost my family's ranch." "That bad luck doesn't matter why anymore?" "Been drifting ever since, trying to figure out what comes next." "Do you miss it? The ranch?" "Every day. But missing something doesn't mean you get to have it back. Sometimes you have to build something new." Danny nodded like he understood exactly what Jake meant. Maybe he did. They finished cleaning the stalls in comfortable silence. As they were putting away the tools, Danny finally said, 7 o'clock tomorrow morning? If you're serious about learning, I am. Danny paused at the stable door. Jake? Thanks for not treating me like I'm broken. After Danny left, Jake stood alone in the stable, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of horses settling in for the evening. He was starting to understand what Robert had seen in this arrangement. The kid wasn't broken. He was just dealing with something too big to handle alone. Maybe they could help each other after all. 3 weeks into Jake's stay at the Blackwood Ranch, he'd settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Early mornings in the stable with Danny, afternoons working on equipment maintenance and property improvements, evenings by himself. In the guest house, Danny was proving to be everything his father had hoped, eager to learn, naturally gifted with animals, and slowly coming out of the shell of anger he'd built around himself. But Jake was starting to realize there were layers. To this family that he didn't understand yet. It was a Thursday evening when things became clearer. Jake was in the stable, checking on Amare, who'd seemed a little off her feed that day, when he heard voices coming from the main house. The windows were open to the spring air, and sound carried further than people probably realized. "I don't understand why you're doing this to yourself, Robert." The voice belonged to a woman older, with the kind of authority that came from years of getting her way. "It's been 6 months. You need to start moving forward." "I am moving forward, Margaret." Robert's voice was strained, tired. "This is me moving forward. Hiring some drifter to play cowboy with Danny? That's not moving forward. That's running away from reality." Jake froze. He knew he should leave, give them privacy, but something kept him listening. "His name is Jake, and he's not playing anything," Robert said. "Danny's better than he's been since Helen died. He's eating again, sleeping through the night, actually talking to me about things that matter. You could have hired a proper instructor. Someone with credentials, references, a background check. Instead, you take in some stranger who showed up in a snowstorm?" There was a long pause before Robert answered. "You wanted to know why I hired Jake? Because when I looked at him, I saw myself 30 years ago. Before the company, before the money, before I forgot who I really was. Jake felt like he was intruding on something deeply personal, but he couldn't make himself leave. Helen used to worry that I was losing myself," Robert continued. "She'd watch me in board meetings, at charity functions, playing the part of the successful businessman, and she'd say I was becoming someone she didn't recognize. She was right. Helen was sick, Robert. People say things when they're fighting cancer that they don't really mean. No." Robert's voice was firm. She meant every word. "And she was trying to tell me something important before she died." "Something?" I was too busy being successful to hear. Jake heard footsteps, like someone was pacing. "The night before Helen's last surgery, she made me promise something," Robert said. "She made me promise that after she was gone, I wouldn't let Danny grow up thinking that money and success were the most important things in life. She wanted him to understand the value of honest work, of using your hands to build something real. You can teach him that without bringing strangers into your home. Can I? When's the last time I'd built something with my own hands? When's the last time I did anything that didn't involve a computer or a conference room?" Robert's voice cracked slightly. "I've been so busy being rich that I forgot how to be real." "Jake knows how to be real. That's why Danny responds to him." Jake quietly backed away from the stable and headed for his guest house. He'd heard enough to understand what he'd walked into, and it was bigger than just a job helping a grieving kid. The next morning, Danny showed up at the stable right on time, like always. But Jake could see something was different in the kid's demeanor, less guarded, more open. "You're quiet today," Jake observed as they worked on grooming the horses. Danny was brushing Luna with careful, methodical strokes. "I heard Dad talking to Grandmother last night. About you, about why you're here." Jake kept working on the horse he was grooming, giving Danny space to say whatever was on his mind. "She thinks Dad's having some kind of breakdown hiring you. But I don't think that's what this is about." Danny paused in his brushing. "I think he's trying to figure out how to be the kind of father Mom wanted him to be." The kid was more perceptive than Jake had given him credit for. "What do you think about that?" "I think Mom was right about a lot of things." Danny moved to Luna's other side. "Before she got sick, she used to take me to this little ranch outside town every summer. We'd spend a week there, learning to rope cattle, fixing fences, sleeping under the stars. Dad was always too busy to come with us." Jake nodded, encouraging him to continue. "Mom said those weeks taught me more about who I really was than all the private schools and tutors combined. She said there was something about working with your hands, taking care of animals, that connected you to what really mattered." Danny's voice got softer. "She made me promise that no matter how much money we had, I'd never forget that the most important things in life couldn't be bought." They worked in comfortable silence for a while. Then Danny spoke up again. "Is that why you're really here? To teach me what Mom wanted me to learn?" Jake set down his brush and looked at the kid, really looked at him. "I'm here because your dad offered me work when I needed it. But if you're asking whether I think your mom was right about the important things in life, then yes, I do. Tell me about your ranch, the one you lost. Jake had been dreading this conversation, but maybe it was time. It was a small place, nothing fancy like this. My family had run cattle on it for 3 generations. When my dad died, I thought I could make it work on my own, but I made some bad decisions, took on too much debt trying to modernize everything. Do you regret losing it? Every day. But not because of the money or the property. I regret losing the connection to something my family had built with their own hands, something that mattered beyond just making a profit. Danny nodded like he understood completely. That's what Mom was trying to tell Dad, wasn't it? That success without meaning is just emptiness. Jake was struck by how mature this kid sounded when he talked about things that mattered to him. Your mom sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. And she loved Dad, but she worried about him. She used to say he was so busy climbing the mountain of success that he forgot to enjoy the view from where he was. That evening, Jake was surprised by a knock on his guest house door. Robert stood there with 2 cups of coffee and a nervous expression. Mind if I come in? I think we need to talk. They sat by the fireplace, and for a long moment neither man spoke. Finally, Robert broke the silence. Danny told me you two had a conversation about Helen today, about the ranch she used to take him to. He's a good kid, Robert. You should be proud of him. I am. But I'm also terrified I'm going to mess him up the way I messed up everything else that mattered. Robert stared into his coffee cup like it held answers he desperately needed. I built my company from nothing. Started in a garage, worked 80-hour days, sacrificed everything to make it successful. By the time I realized what I'd given up in the process, it felt too late to change. What had you given up? Time with Helen, time with Danny, the ability to find joy in simple things. I became someone who measured everything by profit margins and market share. Robert looked up at Jake. Helen tried to pull me back, tried to help me remember who I used to be, but I was too stubborn to listen. Jake could hear the regret in Robert's voice, the weight of opportunities missed. The night before her last surgery, she made me promise something, Robert continued. She made me promise that after she was gone, I'd teach Danny that there were more important things than money and success. That I'd show him how to build a life that mattered, not just a bank account that impressed people. And you think I can help with that? Robert met Jake's eyes. I think you already are. In 3 weeks, you've taught Danny more about real work and honest values than I've managed in 16 years. You've reminded him, and me, that the best things in life come from what you build with your own hands. Jake was quiet for a moment, processing what Robert had shared. So this isn't just about helping Danny deal with grief. No, it's about helping both of us learn how to live the kind of life Helen would have wanted us to live. The kind of life that honors her memory by focusing on what really matters. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down. Finally, Jake spoke. Your wife sounds like she knew what she was talking about. Maybe it's time we both started listening to her. Robert smiled, the first genuinely peaceful smile Jake had seen from him. I think she'd like that. As Robert headed back to the main house, Jake realized he wasn't just helping a kid learn ranch work anymore. He was part of something bigger. A family trying to find their way back to what mattered most, guided by the wisdom of someone who was no longer there but whose love still shaped everything they did. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Jake was teaching Danny how to repair a broken fence post. Robert's phone rang, and Jake could tell from his expression that something was wrong. I'll be right there, Robert said into the phone, his face grim. He turned to Jake and Danny. That was Danny's school. There's been an incident. Danny's face went pale. What kind of incident? A fight. They want us there immediately. The drive to Danny's private school was tense. Danny sat in the back seat, staring out the window, while Robert gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. Jake found himself in the middle of a family crisis he wasn't sure he belonged in. The school was the kind of place that screamed expensive, manicured lawns, brick buildings, students in uniforms that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Inside, they were led to the principal's office. where a stern-looking woman in her 50s waited with a boy about Danny's age who had a black eye and a split lip. "Mr. Blackwood," the principal said, "thank you for coming so quickly. I'm afraid we have a serious situation." The other boys' parents were already there, a couple who looked like they belonged on magazine covers, all polished and perfect. The father was red-faced and angry. "Your son attacked my boy for no reason," the man said before anyone could make proper introductions. "Kevin was just walking to class when Danny jumped him." Danny started to speak, but the principal held up her hand. "Let me explain what happened. According to witnesses, there was an altercation in the hallway between Danny and Kevin. Harsh words were exchanged, and then Danny threw the first punch." "That's not the whole story," Danny said, his voice tight with anger. "The whole story is that you're a violent delinquent who doesn't belong in a civilized school," Kevin's mother said coldly. Jake watched Danny's face flush red, saw his hands clench into fists. The kid was about to explode, and Jake could see that Robert was too shocked by the situation to know how to handle it. "What did Kevin say to Danny before the fight started?" Jake asked quietly. Everyone turned to look at him like they'd forgotten he was there. Kevin's father looked annoyed. "Who are you exactly?" "Someone who's spent enough time around teenage boys to know they don't usually throw punches over nothing," Jake replied calmly. The principal consulted her notes. The witnesses said Kevin made some comments about Danny's mother. "What kind of comments?" Robert asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Kevin shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His parents exchanged glances. "Well?" Jake pressed. "What did you say about his mom?" Kevin mumbled something under his breath. "Speak up, son," Jake said. "If you're going to say something, say it loud enough for everyone to hear." "I said she was probably glad to be dead so she didn't have to deal with him anymore," Kevin said defiantly. The room went dead silent. Robert's face went white and Danny looked like he'd been slapped. Jake felt anger surge through him, but he kept his voice level. "And what exactly did you hope to accomplish by saying that?" Kevin's father jumped in. "Look, boys say stupid things sometimes, but that doesn't justify violence, doesn't it?" Jake turned to face the man. "If someone said that about your dead wife, what would you do?" "I'd handle it like a civilized adult." "Danny's not an adult. He's a 16-year-old kid who lost his mother 6 months ago." Jake's voice was still calm, but there was steel underneath it. "Someone just told him his mother was glad to be dead to get away from him. If you think that doesn't justify a punch in the mouth, then you don't understand the first thing about protecting your family's honor." Kevin's mother looked appalled. "Are you actually defending this violence?" "I'm saying that actions have consequences," Jake replied. "Your son chose to attack a grieving kid in the cruelest way possible. What did you think would happen?" The principal tried to regain control of the situation. "Regardless of what was said, we have a zero-tolerance policy for fighting. Danny will be suspended for 1 week." "And what happens to Kevin?" Robert asked. "Kevin didn't throw any punches. He'll receive detention for inappropriate language." Jake could see Danny's shoulders slump in defeat. The kid was being punished for defending his mother's memory while the boy who'd attacked it got a slap on the wrist. "Come on," Jake said, standing up. "We're leaving." Robert looked surprised. "Jake, we're leaving," Jake repeated firmly. "Danny, let's go." In the parking lot, Danny finally broke down. All the anger and frustration and grief he'd been holding in came pouring out. "It's not fair," he said, tears streaming down his face. "He had no right to say that about Mom. She was the best person I knew, and she loved me more than anything, and he just ... Danny couldn't finish the sentence. Jake put a hand on the kid's shoulder. "You did the right thing, Danny, sometimes. Standing up for what matters is more important than following rules." Robert looked uncertain. "Jake, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but maybe we should what? Let people disrespect Helen's memory because it's more civilized?" Jake turned to face Robert. "Your wife wanted Danny to learn about honor and standing up for what's right? Well, today he did exactly that." Danny wiped his eyes and looked at Jake. "So what happens now?" "I'm suspended. Dad's probably going to ground me, and everyone at school thinks I'm some kind of violent Freak. Jake made a decision that surprised even him. How do you feel about camping? What? Camping. 3 days in the mountains, just you and me. We'll take the horses, set up camp by a stream, do some fishing, and have some real conversations about life, loss, and what it means to be a man. Danny looked intrigued despite his emotional state. Dad would never let me skip school for camping, Jake looked at Robert. Your son just got suspended for defending his mother's honor. You can send him home to sit in his room feeling ashamed, or you can let him spend that time learning something important about himself. Robert was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the decision. Finally, he looked at Danny. Do you want to go? Danny nodded eagerly. Yeah, I really do. Then go. But Jake's right. This is about learning something important, not just vacation time. 2 hours later, Jake and Danny were loading supplies onto pack horses behind the main stable. Danny had never been camping the real way, sleeping under stars, cooking over an open fire, depending on yourself for everything you needed. Are you sure about this? Danny asked as they secured the last of their gear. I mean, I've never done anything like this before. That's exactly why we're doing it, Jake replied. Sometimes the best way to figure out who you are is to strip away everything comfortable and familiar. They rode out that afternoon, following a trail that led up into the mountains behind the ranch. Danny was a natural horseman, and his gelding responded well to his confident handling. As they climbed higher, the air got cooler and cleaner, and Jake could see some of the tension leaving Danny's shoulders. They made camp that evening beside a small stream, surrounded by tall pines and the kind of silence you can only find far from civilization. Jake showed Danny how to set up a proper campsite, how to build a fire that would last through the night, how to cook simple food that tasted like a feast when you were hungry and tired. As they sat by the fire after dinner, Danny finally spoke about what had happened at school. I know I shouldn't have hit him, he said quietly. But when he said that about Mom, it was like something just snapped inside me. Tell me about that feeling, Jake said. What did it feel like when he said those words? Danny stared into the fire, thinking, like someone had reached inside my chest and squeezed my heart with a dirty hand. Like everything good and clean about Mom's memory was being covered in mud. Jake nodded. And what did hitting him accomplish? It made him shut up. It showed him that he couldn't just say whatever he wanted without consequences. Danny paused. But it also got me suspended and made Dad look bad in front of those people. Do you regret it? Danny considered the question seriously. I regret that it caused problems for Dad, but I don't regret standing up for Mom. She would have done the same thing for me. They talked until late that night about grief, about honor, about the difference between doing what's right and doing what's easy. Jake shared stories from his own youth, times when he'd had to choose between fitting in and standing up for his values. My dad used to say that a man's character isn't measured by how he acts when everything's going well, Jake told Danny. It's measured by how he acts when he's tested, when doing the right thing costs him something. Is that what happened today? I was being tested. What do you think? Danny was quiet for a while, listening to the fire crackle and the stream flow over the rocks. I think I passed the test, even if it didn't feel like winning. The next morning, Jake taught Danny how to fish the mountain stream, how to read the water and understand where the trout were likely to be hiding. They caught enough for breakfast and lunch, cleaning and cooking their catch over the open fire. This is different than the ranch Mom used to take me to, Danny said as they cleaned up after lunch. That place felt safe, controlled. This feels real. What's the difference? Out here, if we screw up, there's no safety net, no one to call for help, no backup plan. We have to take care of ourselves and each other. Jake smiled. And how does that feel? Scary, but also good, like I'm finally old enough to be trusted with something important. 2 months after the camping trip, life at the Blackwood Ranch had settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Danny was thriving under Jake's guidance. His grades had improved. He was sleeping better, and the angry outbursts that had worried Robert so much were becoming rare. The relationship between father and son was healing, slowly but surely, but Jake was starting to feel the weight of living in a world that wasn't really his. It started with small things. The way the household staff treated him with polite distance. Never quite sure if he was an employee or a guest. The expensive clothes Robert had bought him that felt wrong on his skin. The formal dinners where he was expected to make conversation with Robert's business associates about things he didn't understand or care about. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening when Robert was hosting a dinner party for potential investors. Jake had tried to beg off, but Robert insisted he join them. "You're part of this family now," Robert had said. "These people should meet you." Jake found himself sitting at a dining room table that could have seated 20 people, surrounded by men and women in suits that cost more than most people's cars. The conversation flowed around topics like market projections, venture capital, and expansion strategies. Jake tried to follow along, but it was like listening to people speak a foreign language. "So, Jake," said a woman named Patricia, one of Robert's business partners, "Robert tells us you're working with his son. What exactly is your background in child psychology?" Jake set down his fork carefully. "I don't have any background in child psychology. I work with horses and teach ranch skills." Patricia's smile became strained. "I see. And you feel qualified to counsel a grieving teenager because ... I don't counsel anyone. I just teach practical skills and try to set a good example." Robert jumped in. "Jake's approach with Danny has been incredibly effective. Sometimes the best therapy is honest work and genuine connection." Patricia exchanged glances with the man sitting next to her. "Well, I suppose everyone has their methods." The conversation moved on, but Jake could feel the judgment in the room. These people saw him as some kind of curiosity, the hired help that Robert had gotten too attached to. He was an outsider playing dress-up in their world, and everyone knew it. After dinner, Jake escaped to the porch for some air. He was standing there, feeling completely out of place, when Robert's business partner, a man named Charles, joined him. "Beautiful night," Charles said, lighting an expensive cigar. "Yes, sir, it is." Charles puffed on his cigar for a moment. "Can I speak frankly with you, Jake?" Jake had a feeling he knew where this was going, but he nodded. "Robert's been through a terrible loss, and grief can make people do things they wouldn't normally do. Bringing strangers into his home, making hasty decisions about his son's care." Charles turned to face Jake directly. "I'm concerned that he's being taken advantage of during a vulnerable time." Jake felt his jaw tighten. "I'm not taking advantage of anyone. Maybe not intentionally. But look at this from an outside perspective. A drifter with no family, no permanent address, no references, suddenly becomes indispensable to a wealthy widower and his troubled son. It's a convenient situation for someone in your position." "What exactly are you suggesting?" Charles shrugged. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just saying that people in Robert's position attract a certain type of person. People who see opportunity in tragedy." Jake stared at Charles for a long moment, fighting the urge to say something he'd regret. "I think this conversation is over." "I hope so, for Robert's sake and for the boys." Jake walked away before he did something stupid, but Charles's words stayed with him. The worst part was that some of what the man had said was true. Jake was living in luxury he'd never experienced, earning more money than he'd ever made, all because he'd happened to break down in the right place at the right time. The doubts that Charles had planted grew over the next few days. Jake started noticing things he'd ignored before, the way some of the staff looked at him, the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room, the subtle ways he was reminded that he didn't belong in this world. It all came to a head the following Monday when Robert asked Jake to join him in his study after dinner. "I wanted to discuss your salary," Robert said, pulling out a folder. "It's been 3 months now, and I think it's time for an adjustment." Robert slid a piece of paper across the desk. The number on it made Jake's breath catch. It was more than double what he was currently earning. "This is too much," Jake said immediately. Robert looked surprised. "Too much?" "Jake, you've transformed my son's life. You've brought our family closer together than we've been since Helen died. This is the least I can do." I can't accept this. Why not? Jake stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the stables where he and Danny spent their mornings. Because people are starting to talk? Your business partners, some of the staff, they think I'm taking advantage of your grief, using your son to get close to your money. Robert's face darkened. Who said that to you? It doesn't matter who said it. What matters is that they're not entirely wrong. How can you say that? Jake turned back to face Robert. Because look at me. 3 months ago, I was sleeping in my truck, wondering where my next meal was coming from. Now I'm living in luxury, earning more money than I've ever made, all because I happened to break down in front of your house during a snowstorm. You're here because you've been good for Danny, because you've helped our family heal. And what happens when Danny doesn't need me anymore? When he graduates, goes to college, starts his own life? Do I just keep living here, drawing a salary for work that doesn't exist? Robert was quiet for a moment. Is that what you're worried about? Your long-term security here? I'm worried about what I'm becoming, Jake said honestly. I'm worried that I'm getting too comfortable with a life that isn't really mine, that I'm losing sight of who I actually am. They stood in silence for a while, the weight of Jake's words hanging between them. What are you saying, Jake? That you want to leave? Jake rubbed his face with his hands. I don't know what I'm saying. I just know that something feels wrong, and I can't figure out what it is. Robert sat down heavily in his chair. You know, Helen used to worry about this exact thing. She'd say that money and comfort could be just as dangerous as poverty and struggle because they made you forget who you really were. Maybe she was right. Maybe she was. But she also believed that sometimes people come into our lives exactly when we need them most, and that turning away from those connections because they feel too good to be true is just another form of fear. Jake looked at Robert, seeing the worry and confusion in his friend's eyes, because that's what Robert had become, despite the difference in their circumstances, a friend. I'm not going anywhere right now, Jake said finally, but I need to figure out how to do this without losing myself in the process. Robert nodded. Fair enough. But Jake, don't let other people's jealousy and small-mindedness convince you that good things can't happen to good people. Sometimes they can, and sometimes they do. The next morning, Danny was waiting for Jake at the stables with an unusual expression on his face. Everything okay? Jake asked. Dad told me you're thinking about leaving, Jake sighed. Your dad shouldn't have said that. Are you thinking about leaving? Jake looked at the kid, really looked at him. In 3 months, Danny had grown taller, stronger, more confident. The angry, broken boy Jake had first met was gone, replaced by a young man who was finding his way in the world. I'm thinking about a lot of things, Jake said carefully. Danny was quiet for a moment, brushing Luna with long, steady strokes. Do you remember what you told me on that camping trip? About how a man's character is measured by how he acts when he's tested. I remember. Well, I think you're being tested now. And I think the test is whether you'll run away when things get complicated or whether you'll stick around and figure out how to make it work. Jake had to smile at that. When did you get so smart? I had a good teacher. They worked together in comfortable silence, but Jake could feel the weight of Danny's words. The kid was right. This was a test. Not just of Jake's character, but of his ability to build something real and lasting without losing himself in the process. That evening, Jake made a decision. He walked up to the main house and found Robert in his study. I've been thinking about what you said, Jake told him. About Helen's belief that people come into our lives when we need them most. Robert looked up from his paperwork. And I think maybe she was right. But I also think there's a difference between accepting help when you need it and becoming dependent on it. Jake sat down across from Robert. I want to make a counter-proposal to your salary increase. Robert raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. I want you to help me buy back a piece of my family's old ranch. Not give me the money, loan it to me at a fair interest rate. Let me earn my way back to where I belong, instead of just living off your generosity. Robert leaned back in his chair, considering. And in the meantime? In the meantime, I keep working with Danny, keep helping where I can. But as a man earning his way toward his own future, not as someone who's given up his Independence for security? Robert smiled, the first genuine smile Jake had seen from him in days. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning in late spring. 6 months after Jake had first arrived at the Blackwood Ranch, Danny had been making incredible progress in his riding skills, and Jake had started teaching him some advanced techniques on the trail course they'd built behind the stables. Remember, it's all about reading the horse's body language, Jake called out as Danny guided his gelding Thunder through a series of tight turns around wooden posts. Let him tell you what he needs to balance himself. Danny was focused, confident, working in perfect harmony with his horse. Jake watched with pride as the kid navigated the course with the skill of someone who'd been riding for years instead of months. The angry, broken boy he'd first met was completely gone, replaced by a young man who knew his own worth. Looking good, Jake said as Danny completed the course. Want to try the water crossing? The water crossing was the most challenging part of their trail course, a shallow creek that required both horse and rider to trust each other completely. Most horses were naturally nervous about water, and it took skill and patience to guide them through. Danny grinned, his face bright with confidence. Let's do it. Jake watched as Danny rode Thunder toward the creek. The horse approached the water, cautiously, which was normal. Danny leaned forward slightly, encouraging him with gentle pressure from his legs and soft words. Everything was going perfectly. Then something spooked Thunder, maybe a fish jumping, maybe just a shadow moving. Wrong. The horse shied suddenly to the left, his hooves slipping on the wet rocks at the creek's edge. Danny tried to stay with him, but Thunder's sudden movement threw him off balance. Jake watched in horror as Danny fell, his head hitting a large rock beside the creek with a sickening thud. Thunder scrambled to safety on the far side of the water, but Danny lay motionless on the rocky shore. Danny! Jake was running before he'd even finished shouting the boy's name. He splashed through the creek and dropped to his knees beside the still form. Danny's eyes were closed, and there was blood on the rock where his head had hit. Jake's emergency training from his ranch days kicked in. He checked Danny's pulse, steady but weak. The boy was breathing, but he wasn't responding to Jake's voice. There was a cut on his scalp that was bleeding freely, and Jake could see that Danny's left arm was bent at an unnatural angle. Danny, can you hear me? Jake said, keeping his voice calm despite the panic racing through him. Come on, kid, talk to me. No response. Jake pulled out his cell phone and called 911, his hands shaking as he gave their location to the dispatcher. Then he called Robert. Jake, what's wrong? Robert's voice immediately went tight with worry. Danny's been hurt. He fell from his horse and hit his head. The ambulance is coming, but you need to get to the hospital. We're going to meet them there. There was silence on the other end of the line for a moment, then Robert's voice barely controlled. How bad is it? Jake looked down at Danny's still form, fighting the urge to sugarcoat the situation. It's serious, Robert. Head injury, possible concussion. Definitely a broken arm. But he's breathing and his pulse is steady. I'm on my way to the hospital. Now. Jake stayed with Danny, talking to him constantly, even though the boy couldn't respond, keeping pressure on the head wound to slow the bleeding. He'd never prayed much, but he found himself bargaining with whatever forces might be listening. This kid had been through enough. He deserved better than this. The paramedics arrived within 20 minutes, though it felt like hours to Jake. He watched as they carefully stabilized Danny's neck and loaded him onto a stretcher. One of the paramedics, a woman named Linda, asked Jake what had happened. Horse shied at the water crossing, Jake explained as they loaded Danny into the ambulance. He fell and hit his head on that rock. He was conscious for maybe a minute. After the fall, then he just died. You did good keeping pressure on the wound, Linda said. Probably saved him from losing too much blood. Jake rode with Danny in the ambulance, holding the boy's uninjured hand and continuing to talk to him. You're going to be okay, Danny. Your dad's meeting us at the hospital, and these folks know what they're doing. You just hang in there. At the hospital, Jake had to stay in the waiting room while the doctors worked on Danny. Robert arrived looking like he'd aged 10 years in the hour since Jake's phone call. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he paced the small waiting area. "Tell me exactly what happened," Robert said. Jake explained about the water crossing, how Thunder had shied, how Danny had fallen. As he talked, he could see Robert's expression change from worry to something else, something that looked almost like blame. "You said it was advanced training," Robert said when Jake finished. "How advanced? Was it dangerous?" "Every aspect of riding has some risk," Jake said carefully. "But Danny was ready for this. He's been working up to it for months." "Ready? He's 16 years old, Jake. He's not a professional rider." Jake could hear the fear and anger mixing in Robert's voice, and he understood it. When someone you love gets hurt, you need someone to blame. Right now, he was the most convenient target. "Robert, I would never put Danny in a situation I didn't think he could handle. This was a freak accident, the kind of thing that can happen to any rider at any skill level." Robert stopped pacing and stared at Jake. "But it happened on your watch, while you were teaching him something you thought he was ready for." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Because Robert was right, it had happened on his watch, while he was pushing Danny to try something new and challenging. Before Jake could respond, a doctor in scrubs approached them. "Mr. Blackwood? I'm Dr. Sarah Chun. I've been treating your son." Robert immediately focused on the doctor. "How is he?" "He's stable." The head injury was serious, a significant concussion, but the CT scan doesn't show any bleeding or swelling in the brain. "That's very good news. His arm is broken, but it's a clean break that should heal well with proper treatment." "When will he wake up?" Robert asked. "That's harder to predict with head injuries. It could be hours or it could be a day or two. But his vital signs are strong and we're optimistic about his recovery." Robert sagged with relief. "Can I see him?" "Of course. He's in room 314, one visitor at a time for now." As Robert headed toward the elevator, Jake started to follow, but Robert turned back. "I think it's best if you wait here for now," Robert said quietly. Jake stopped, feeling like he'd been slapped. "Robert, I just want to make sure he's okay." "I know you do, but right now, I need to be with my son, alone." Jake watched Robert disappear into the elevator, then sat down heavily in one of the waiting room chairs. The message was clear. Robert blamed him for what had happened to Danny, and Jake wasn't welcome at the boy's bedside. He sat there for hours, drinking bad coffee from vending machines and replaying the accident over and over in his mind. Had he pushed Danny too hard? Had he missed some sign that Thunder was more spooked than usual? Was this his fault? Around midnight, Robert came back to the waiting room. He looked exhausted, wrung out from hours of sitting beside his unconscious son. "Any change?" Jake asked. "Not yet. But the doctor says that's normal." Robert sat down across from Jake and, for the first time since the accident, really looked at him. "Jake, I owe you an apology." Jake shook his head. "No, you don't. If Danny had been hurt on my watch, I'd be looking for someone to blame too. But you're not to blame. I've been sitting up there, thinking about everything that's happened since you came into our lives. Danny's been happier, more confident, more himself than he's been since Helen died. The risks he was taking today, those aren't the kind of risks that reckless people take. They're the kind of risks that confident, skilled people take when they trust their abilities and their teacher." Robert leaned forward, his voice earnest. "Helen always said that the goal of parenting wasn't to keep your kids safe from everything. It was to give them the skills and confidence to handle whatever life threw at them. That's what you've been doing with Danny." Jake felt some of the guilt that had been crushing him start to ease. "I still should have been more careful. Should have seen that Thunder was nervous. Maybe this is just life reminding us that we can't control everything, no matter how careful we are." Robert managed a small smile. "Do you know what Danny said to me the last time we talked about you? He said you were the first adult who ever treated him like he was capable of handling real challenges. He said you made him feel strong instead of fragile." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Robert spoke again. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me, okay? When you first got that phone call today, when you realized Danny was seriously hurt, what was the first thing you felt?" Jake thought about it. Terror. Pure, gut-level terror that I was going to lose him. Not that you were going to lose your job, or your place at the ranch, or your future plans. You were afraid you were going to lose him. Yeah, Robert nodded slowly. That's when I knew for sure that you weren't just some drifter who'd lucked into a good situation. You love my son. Really love him like family. Jake felt his throat tighten. I do, and he loves you too. Like the uncle he never had, like the mentor his mother always hoped he'd find. Danny woke up 36 hours after the accident, his eyes fluttering open to find Jake and Robert asleep in chairs on either side of his hospital bed. For a moment, he just lay there, trying to remember what had happened. Then the memories came flooding back. Thunder shying at the creek, the fall, the sharp pain in his head before everything went dark. "Dad?" he whispered, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd removed that morning. Robert's eyes snapped open immediately. "Danny, thank God, you're awake." He reached for his son's hand, careful not to jostle the IV line. "How do you feel?" Like, I got kicked by a horse," Danny said with a weak smile. "Is Jake here?" Jake stirred at the sound of his name, sitting up with the confused look of someone who'd been sleeping in a chair for too long. When he saw Danny's open eyes, relief flooded his face. "Hey there, Cowboy," Jake said softly. "You gave us quite a scare." Danny looked between the two men, taking in their rumpled clothes and worried faces. "How long was I out?" "A day and a half." Robert said, "But the doctors say you're going to be fine. Concussion, broken arm, but no permanent damage." Danny tried to sit up, wincing as the movement made his head throb. "Thunder, is he okay?" Jake had to smile at that. Only Danny would wake up from a serious head injury and immediately worry about the horse that had thrown him. "Thunder's fine. A little shaken up, but no injuries. He's back at the stable, probably wondering where his favorite riding partner is." "Good." Danny settled back against his pillows, looking thoughtful. "Jake, I need to tell you something." "What's that?" "It wasn't your fault. The accident, I mean. I know Dad probably blamed you at first. Parents always need someone to blame when their kids get hurt. But it wasn't anyone's fault. Thunder got spooked. I fell. Stuff happens." Jake felt a weight lift off his shoulders that he hadn't even realized was still there. "Thanks for saying that, Danny, but I still should have been more careful." "No, you shouldn't have. If you'd been more careful, you would have been treating me like I was made of glass, like everyone else does. You treated me like I was capable of handling real challenges, and that meant accepting real risks." Danny's voice got stronger as he spoke. "That's the most important thing anyone's ever given me." Over the next week, as Danny recovered in the hospital, Jake and Robert had long conversations about the future. The accident had clarified something for both of them. They were family now, in all the ways that mattered. But families needed more than just emotional bonds. They needed practical foundations to build on. "I've been thinking about what you said," Robert told Jake one afternoon as they sat in Danny's room, watching the boy sleep off his pain medication, "about buying back part of your family's ranch." "Yeah? I did some research." "The Riverside property that borders our land, it used to be part of your family's operation, didn't it?" Jake nodded. "The eastern section. My grandfather sold it during the Depression, but my dad always regretted losing it. Some of the best grazing land in the county. Well, it's for sale again. The current owners are retiring, moving to Arizona." Robert pulled out his phone and showed Jake a real estate listing. "What do you think?" Jake stared at the photos, his heart racing. It was exactly what he dreamed of. Enough land to run a small cattle operation, good water rights, a house that needed work but had solid bones. "I think it's perfect." "But Robert, this is a lot of money. Are you sure about the loan arrangement?" "I'm not talking about a loan anymore, Jake. I'm talking about a partnership." Jake looked up from the phone, confused. "What kind of partnership?" Robert leaned forward, his voice excited. "Think about it. You know, ranching, I know business. You understand the land, I understand finance and marketing. Together, we could build something really special, a working ranch that's also a teaching operation." "Teaching operation?" "Like what you've been doing with Danny, but expanded." Kids from the city who need to learn about real work, real responsibility. Families dealing with loss who need a place to heal. We could create the kind of place that Helen always talked about, somewhere people could connect with what really matters. Jake was quiet for a long moment, imagining the possibilities. You really think something like that could work? I think it's exactly what we're both meant to be doing. You get your family land back, I get to build something meaningful instead of just making money, and Danny gets to grow up in a place that honors his mother's values. Danny stirred in his bed, his eyes opening slightly. Are you guys planning my future without me again? Robert laughed. We're planning all our futures. How do you feel about the idea of living on a working ranch, helping teach other kids about horses and responsibility? Danny's face lit up despite his obvious fatigue. Are you serious? That sounds amazing. Like summer camp, but year-round and actually useful. 3 months later, on a crisp fall morning, Jake stood on the porch of his new house. His old house. Really, the one his grandfather had built with his own hands. It had taken a lot of work to make it livable again, but it was home in a way that nowhere else had ever been. The Riverside Ranch was officially a partnership between Jake Martinez and Robert Blackwood, with Danny listed as a junior partner who would inherit Jake's share when he came of age. They'd kept the original house for Jake, built a new modern home for Robert and Danny on the hill overlooking the valley, and converted the old barn into a teaching facility. Their first group of students would arrive next week, 6 teenagers from the city, whose parents thought they needed to learn about hard work and responsibility. Jake was nervous about it, but excited too. This was bigger than anything he'd ever attempted, but it felt right in a way that nothing else in his life ever had. Jake, Danny called from the corral, where he was working with Thunder on water. Crossings again. His arm had healed completely, and he'd insisted on getting back on the horse that had thrown him. Come watch this. Jake walked over to the fence, where Robert was already standing with a cup of coffee and a proud smile on his face. Danny guided Thunder to the small creek they'd built into the training area, and this time both horse and rider approached the water with complete confidence. Thunder stepped into the stream without hesitation, and Danny sat easy in the saddle, completely relaxed. Perfect, Jake called out. That's how it's supposed to look. Danny rode over to the fence, grinning. Feel like taking a trail ride? I want to check on the new calves in the upper pasture. Sounds good to me, Jake said. Robert, you coming? Robert had been taking riding lessons from both Jake and Danny, slowly learning the skills his wife had tried to teach him years ago. He wasn't a natural horseman like his son, but he was determined to be part of this new life they were building. Give me 5 minutes to saddle up, Robert said Dot as they prepared for their ride. Jake reflected on how much had changed since that snowy night when his truck had broken down outside the Blackwood gates. He'd been a drifter then, a man without purpose or direction. Now he was part of something bigger than himself. A family, a business, a mission to help other people find their way. They rode out together across land that Jake's great-grandfather had cleared, land where his father had learned to cowboy, land where Danny would someday teach his own children about the values that really mattered. The afternoon sun was warm on their backs, and in the distance they could see cattle grazing peacefully in the golden grass. You know what Mom would say if she could see this? Danny said as they rode. What's that? Robert asked. She'd say we finally figured out that the best way to honor someone's memory is to live the kind of life they would have been proud of. Jake smiled, thinking about Helen Blackwood, the woman he'd never met but whose wisdom had shaped everything good in his life. She'd been right about so many things, that people came into your life exactly when you did them, that the most important things couldn't be bought, that real success was measured by the love you shared and the lives you touched. I think she'd be proud of all of us, Jake said. We've built something real here, something that matters. As they rode toward home in the gathering dusk, Jake felt a peace he'd never experienced before. He'd found his place in the world at last, not just as an employee or a guest, but as a partner, a family member, a man who belonged exactly where he was. The storm that had brought him to the Blackwood Ranch had ended long ago, but the shelter he'd found there had become something. much more than temporary refuge. It had become home, built on foundations of mutual respect, shared purpose, and the kind of love that creates families from strangers. In the end, that was the most valuable thing any of them had learned. That family wasn't just about blood, or marriage, or legal documents. It was about choosing to stand by each other, to build something meaningful together, and to honor the people you loved by living up to their highest hopes for you. They unsaddled their horses in the barn that evening. Jake looked at Robert and Danny, his partner, and his nephew in all the ways that mattered, and knew that Helen's promise had been kept. Danny was growing up understanding that the most important things in life couldn't be bought, that honest work was its own reward, and that the best way to find yourself was to help others do the same. And Jake had found something he'd thought was lost forever, not just land or purpose or financial security,